course, thank you. So I'm Joel Clarke. I'm the technical manager over at HAVI. So I sort of manage the sort of after sales, after support, and the training side of things here at HAVI. So pretty much everything that can and should be known about HAVs, I should know about. So hopefully, none of your questions will stick me.
That's excellent, and I think it's worth pointing out. I think the reason why I've reached out to you guys is I've worked with you guys in the past, and felt your approach to to customers when I worked at a previous company at Tarmac. You try to find solutions to the problems. It's not necessarily just sort of saying, "Here's our products," and pushing our products. Your conversations with us was, what exactly is the problem? What's happening? Why do you think you need these products? And I was really struck by your approach to us as a customer and your professionalism. So that's the main reason why, when we wanted to do some e-learning content and content around HAVs, you were the first guys that sort of jumped to mind, and I thought, yeah, I've got to talk to you. So thank you for participating in this, and I think I'm going to be asking some questions to kind of spur some conversation on with you, Joel, and I hope we will provide some sort of education for anyone who's all participating in our e-learning and watching this recording back.
Excellent.
So people who've been doing this e-learning prior to sort of seeing this recording back, we've learned about the fact that HAVs kind of originated probably in 1911, where there was some research happening about Italian mining happening, and that was very rudimentary. Wasn't a lot of PPE, let's be honest. Jeans and a t-shirt was as best as you got. But also, I remember when I was younger, and you would see sort of news reports about vibrating white finger, about whole body vibration. But that was always, to me, related to coal mining, and coal mining in the 80s and the 70s, where these things started to happen, and then you saw these stories. So is HAVs just not related to that kind of thing?
No, I think it's very easy to sort of fall into that. Like I say, I think it was 1911. Yeah, in the sort of early 1900s, it was an Italian professor who did a bit of a study on some miners in Italy, and discovered that they were using these hammer drills for a long time, and even modern day hammer drills, you can't use them for a really long time without seriously damaging your hands and fingers. So you can only imagine what the hammer drills of over 100 years ago were like. And it sort of ended up being referred to as dead finger for a long time, because it basically get very gangreney frostbite symptoms where the ends of your fingers would eventually start dropping off, because it would just be seen as that. And I think it was then sort of associated with mining, because it was only really miners that were getting it. And then I think HAVs was first listed as an actual disease. Vibration white finger was listed, I think it was in 1985, which obviously for local recent history buffs will know that's obviously when the miners' strikes were happening, the pits were getting closed down. So it's very, as it started to come up, that was, when it was starting to make the news. And then sort of going into like the sort of late 90s, there was a very famous case where 7 miners got awarded £127,000 from the High Court for HAVs, for what happened in the mines back in the 70s and 80s. So that's when it really started to get to the forefront of the news. And then obviously the UK government then set up that fund, which is obviously still active, over £100 million for ex-miners who had those symptoms and those diagnoses to make those claims. So they knew it was a massive issue, and obviously then they're now having to sort of repay that. And then obviously, so that was where all the associations came from, that it was a mining specific thing. And then obviously it sort of came in 2005 when the regulations were properly developed, which is sort of 17 years ago now, and it's absolutely crazy that it's still being perpetuated now. It's not just a thing; it's always going to be a thing. Obviously, as you'll know, there's no cure for this, but the fact that 17 years later we're still talking about HAVs, new cases of HAVs developing all the time, it's quite worrying.
I mean, that's a great point there, Joel. 17 years since the regulations came in, and like you said, you referred back to 2005. So why are we still talking about it? Why, is this still a thing occurring? It seems a bit crazy, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I think obviously the sort of main reason as anybody really has to do anything with HAVs is when the HSE start pressing the point. And obviously the regulations came out in 2005, so there's very little excuse after that. But it's only in the last, I'd say 10 years probably, where the HSE have really started start to push it in, and the practices are getting better, the tools are getting better, but it's still they quite often the attitudes of either operators themselves or the people above them, and those sort of poor safety cultures being passed down, which is causing the problems really.
Okay. So again, from a kind of personal viewpoint, when I remember when I first got my first house and I had to do some DIY. And I remember doing drilling into some concrete and things. And when I'd finished, even though it was a short time, I could feel my fingers tingling and things like that. So was that like the start of HAVS? Is that what people first experienced?
Yeah, it's sort of really. It's very, very common for anybody using. So I don't use power tools a lot myself, and you'd hope that I'd be quite comfortable in making sure I use them properly. But even when I say wash my car or with the jet wash, that sort of thing, you get that tingling in your hands. And the basic reason of it behind it is that vibration isn't really a natural thing, especially into your hands. Bodies aren't designed and they haven't evolved to handle vibrations that comes into the hands. And what the vibration is doing is it's damaging the blood vessels and the nerve endings in the fingers. And then those sort of strange feelings, that tingling, the sort of pain, it's hard to describe it, the pain, but it is really a pain. It's where the blood's coming back in. Exactly the same as if you ever fall asleep and you lean on your hand and you wake up in the night and your hand's absolutely ringing. It's exactly the same sensation. It's just obviously on a smaller scale because it's the vibration. And obviously, if it's that feeling that you get will go away because if you're only picking up a jet wash or a drill to break out some slabs or something in your house, it'll go and you probably won't ever feel any lasting effects of it. But it's when you're doing that repetitive use, when you're doing it constantly, day in, day out, week in, week out, that long-term damage really starts to affect the hands and fingers and just sort of does that permanent damage, which is why it's really important for us to make sure that it's sort of being managed from the get-go, really.
Yeah. So even though I was using that power tool for a short period of time, and I did experience that, that really should be an indicator that perhaps I should have been taking extra precautions or extra measures, even though it was a short period of time.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of obviously things with DIY when you're doing the task. We're saying with HAVS in general, there's lots of different factors that are going to affect your HAVS, and also the task that you're carrying out is the first one. So if you're just using a screwdriver, so sort of similar sort of drills that I've got on my shoulder here. If you're just using a screwdriver and putting a couple of shelves up, those vibrations probably aren't going to really affect you that much. But if you're using a sort of quite often what you see DIY using like a supermarket drill, it's quite often got from the middle aisles of one of those supermarkets, and you'll be using that and breaking out concrete. That task could actually be quite high risk. And obviously there's other factors, there's your age, how many tools you use at work along the side, and also your jobs and hobbies. So if you restore cars on the side for as a sort of a side project for yourself, if you're using sanders and stuff all the time, and then you go out and use your breakers, and then you also go to work and you're using tools, obviously the issue is going to sort of accumulate. Obviously the problem with doing things with DIY at home in particular is you're not actually legally binded with it regards to the HSE. So you could, for example, pick up a chainsaw, use a chainsaw without a guard, without safety goggles, without safety boots, without a hard hat. And it's exactly the same with HAVS. There's nothing stopping you doing that. So I think it's important if you are doing a task, even at home, just to ensure that check up on the task before, read the guidebook at the very least to see how long you can use those tools for before you could be doing yourself some damage.
Yeah, it's an important point, Joel, isn't it? A lot of people in the sort of quarrying and mining industry are well versed now to seeing safe operating procedures, risk assessments, and things like that. But how many would go home and like you say, just grab a tool without sort of thinking of the precautions and just getting on with it?
Exactly.
It comes back to probably my experience and a lot of people's experiences. Well, I'm only going to be 5 minutes, and as we know, 5 minutes, something can go horribly wrong in that period of time.
I think it's sort of the accumulation of those 5 minutes. It's always that, I did 5 minutes here, did 5 minutes there, did 5 minutes there. That adds up. And like I say, it's not like you can use vibration tools for a long time and then it does the damage. The damage is pretty much constant, and then it's just that prolonged usage is what really does the damage.
Excellent. So we've talked a lot about power tools. So is it just connected to power tools or abrasive wheels or angle grinders? Is that all we're talking about here?
So primarily, yes, really. That's where the issue usually arises from. Most cases that you deal with where someone has got either vibration white finger or carpal tunnel, which is that sort of broad term for HAVS. It's usually where they're using a vibrating kit. But in particular with carpal tunnel, there is a genetic element. So you'll have lots of people. There's I can't remember the exact percentage. There's a high percentage of people who with carpal tunnel that have never picked up a tool in their life. So they've never used any vibrating tool. Probably the most electric thing they've ever used would be a toothbrush. That's the most exposure to vibration they've ever had, and they've got carpal tunnel syndrome. So they'll do an entry Q&A with their employer. So an employer will still take them on, and they'll say, right, fill in this HAVS worksheet, and they'll fill in, like, oh, do you get tingling in your fingers? Do I get this and that? And they'll tick yes, and then also they're being referred for a HAVS assessment despite never picking up a vibrating tool. So that's why it's sort of important that. And then there's this sort of Raynaud's phenomenon, which is that sort of red herring, if you like, where the Raynaud's will mimic a white finger attack. So if you the best thing I have to say is to go onto YouTube or something like that and search a Raynaud's attack or a white finger attack, and you can literally see the blood absolutely draining out the fingers. And Raynaud's looks exactly the same as a white finger attack. But again, you can have people with Raynaud's that have never picked up a vibrating tool in their lives. So if someone has those conditions before they start work, they do require that sort of special attention. And so it's not necessarily people who've been using the kit for 30, 40 years that get these symptoms. It could be an apprentice who's never picked up the tool before and already has that starting point. It could already be tier 1 or tier 2 without ever picking up a tool.
Wow, I mean that's really interesting, isn't it? Who would have thought that? And I remember having a conversation with you guys recently where you're explaining that you went to see one company, but that it was something to do with the floor polishing. Do you want to just give us a bit of?
Yeah, I'll sort of give a bit of a background for how quite a lot of companies manage HAVS exposure, where they'll have a sort of a logbook or a timesheet. So they'll give an operator a standard sort of pocket logbook, or they'll have a timesheet they're finishing at the end of the week, and they're told to record their exposure. And this sort of almost always results in them telling you exactly how long their shift was or how long they've had the tool in their hand for. So if you were to ask, if you were to ask someone who's breaking out concrete, so how long are you breaking out concrete? They'll say, well, that was at work for 8 hours. I had an hour lunch. So yeah, I reckon I've used that breaker for 6.5 hours. That's the guess, and it's very easy. It's very natural as a human to overestimate exposure on that sort of thing. It's the same, if you were to ask how long you drive in your car, how long your commute was, you're going to say it's half an hour, it's 45 minutes. You're not going to say it's 23 minutes and 8 seconds. It's exactly the same. And yeah, it was one company we dealt with where they were doing sort of floor polishing, as you say, and they basically had timesheets up on the wall, and they had a table, and it said at the top of that table that operators could not exceed 350 points in one day. It's obviously quite, 50 points, a bit of a buffer zone between that and the actual limit, which is obviously the 400 points. And essentially, this HAVS policy, if an operator didn't exceed 351 points, then an investigation would have been launched. And operators, they wouldn't have to do any extra paperwork, anything like that. And the operators didn't have to record anything if they didn't use any tools. So no prizes for really guessing what happened. Is every single table that said the operator named 350 points, the operator named 350 points, regardless of how much time they were actually using the tool for. So an operator would pick up a polish away for for half an hour or so, and then just put 350 points in there just because they knew, and there was no one sort of checking up on that. And that's where obviously when we talk about sort of the discipline and stuff like that. And the hierarchy of control in particular, if we're putting bad data into a risk assessment, you can't build a good risk assessment from that. And that's so we were working under the assumption these operators were using these polishes for 3 or 4 hours a day, whereas a simple, even a very basic, someone stands behind them with a stopwatch, we'd be able to tell them that it's actually really 20 minutes, half an hour, if that. And the exposure has been massively overstated, and they were dealing with risks that they didn't even have.
Yeah, that is interesting. So, you've already mentioned the regulations, and I think we're starting to sort of come into how that's implemented. But what do employers must have a responsibility towards their employees? So, can you just give us a bit of an overview of what that is?
Yeah, so obviously employers is all sort of covered in the standard sort of health and safety at work act. They're sort of responsible to look after their employees. So they're responsible to provide training, to provide the tools and equipment required to bring the exposure down to as low as reasonably practicable, which is obviously anyone who's ever done any health and safety course at any level will be very familiar with that term, as low as reasonably practicable. And that's the idea, is to use the resources and things available to try and get that exposure as low as you can. Now, is expected to be breaching the EAV, which is obviously the 100 points. There is a set list of actions that operators, that employers, have to take for those operators. So they have to take, health surveillance. They have to do training. So the higher the risk, the more actions that are required. And so the advice that I'd take for an employer, especially ones that aren't entirely sure what they should be doing, is go on the HC website, use the resource. It's not a closed club. It's not locked behind any closed doors. Go on the HC website. All the information is there to start building a basic risk assessment and start managing the risk. And then if you are really stuck, use the experts. Give us a shout. So there's plenty of resources and people out there that do deal with this stuff on a daily basis that know how to manage it.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. So that's the employer side of things. But what about the employees? Obviously hearing this and looking back at sort of my experience of my first DIY and, making a mess of my first house with my drill in hand, what kind of responsibility of an employee do I have?
Yeah, also the thing with the employees, HAVs can always be seen as a bit of witchcraft. There's this complicated formula behind, each tool you can use for a different period of time, and it's going to give you a different number of points that don't always seem to add up in the way you'd expect them to. And so quite often you have an operator say, this tool is, I've got this massive breaker that's the worst thing I've ever held, and you measure it, and it's actually not that bad, but the little diagram that they've got next to it is actually a lot worse. So it's very difficult for an employee who doesn't know anything about it to learn what the risks are. So again, first bit of advice I'd say is use the resource. So the HSE have a section entirely for employees, for people who are using the tools, people who are at risk. And gives you ideas about things you can do things that your employers should be doing for a start. So if your employers aren't ticking these boxes, you can bring it up with the employers, or bring it up with your trade union rep or your employee rep, whoever's relevant for your industry. So yeah, the HC have got that list of what your employees should be doing. And there's also a list of things that you can be doing. Things like keeping your hands warm, making sure you're taking regular breaks, making sure you're using the right tool for the right job. The things that are important for the employer. And obviously, then if you have any concerns and stuff that aren't being recognised, if your employer sort of telling you to sort of crack on and you feel you've been put at risk, I say use the trade union reps, use those avenues to raise them, and also if you do get any symptoms or any diagnosis or anything like that, to make people aware as early as possible, because like we keep saying, it doesn't get any better, it only ever gets worse. So if you are experiencing symptoms and that sort of thing, just if you nip it in the bud earlier, you're more likely to sort of minimise the damage, really.
Yeah, that's key, I think, to a lot of this, is that you can be using a power tool and maybe not feel anything, not feel any of the tingling or anything like that, and you think, oh, I'm fine. But the issue is, this is a chronic condition that repeated exposure will start to show itself in a number of years. So it could be 5-10 years or down the line where you really start to feel it. And like you said, once you've got it, there's no getting away. You've got it, and you can't.
Exactly, yeah.
Moment.
And that's quite often one of the challenges we have to get through, particularly we have two different challenges. With the younger operators, they sort of see it as if you're talking about an issue that might come in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's quite hard to get through to them. It's the same with smoking, it's the same with drinking, and it's hard to get through to that. They sort of see it as a down the line problem. And on the flip side of that, you sort of see operators who, I've been using the tool for 20, 30 years now. It's too late, and it's that's why we always try and make the thing. Symptoms are only going to get worse, and you don't want to be doing the daft little things. We haven't talked really about the symptoms too much yet, but things like not being able to change nappies and stuff like that you could, just because you haven't got the feeling in your fingers and stuff like that. When you do have your grandkids, you want to be doing that sort of thing when later down the line.
Yeah, exactly. And this is about protecting your health, and it becomes obviously very important as you older you get, and you suddenly start to realize that these things are creeping up on you. So this is about protect yourself now, and you'll have a better life, or continued life. So you've mentioned about the right tool for the job, and people who've gone through the kind of e-learning prior to this would have been exposed to a couple of different models, sort of hierarchy, of control, and ERIC PD and things like that. So I know that you've been talking to some employers and customers of yourselves where you've actually found, by using kind of maybe an alternative tool, that actually could solve a lot of their problems. So could you just talk a minute about that for us, please?
Yeah, so the sort of the main one we look at, that we use quite often, and we're really proud of, is we work with a lot of landscaping companies. So that could be housing associations to big facilities management companies. that are always using a similar sort of set of kits. You've got your standards, your mowers, your trimmers, your hedge cutters, your blowers, that sort of stuff that if you see any landscaping team on the side of an A road or a local park, they'll always have that set of kit in the van. So, we've seen hundreds and thousands of these tools up and down the country. And one of our customers sort of came to us, and they had sort of hedge cutters and trimmers that were causing them issues that, the operators were basically how to use a hedge cutter for a couple of hours. 2 hours on a hedge cutter might seem like a long time. By the time you've done one stretch of road, you want to come back and do the other stretch of road. It does quite easily creep up on you. So what we did is we sort of used information where we dealt with other customers, and we had one of our customers that was using electric tools. They were using basically a like for like. So if you imagine you got your steel hooks on a petrol models they were using the electric models. And operators quite often, you might experience this, sometimes they're a bit scared of electric tools. They think because it's not making as much noise and it's not whirring as much, it's not as powerful. But these operators who were a bit like that with a lot of things, they were sort of saying, I don't really like the electric mower, I don't really like this. But they're saying these hedge cutters and trimmers, they do just as good a job, but they're electric, and they, the noise is less. They start up instantly. You don't have to oil them. All the regular benefits of it. But what we actually did is it took the exposure on the hedge cut in particular from 2 hours. So you can use that hedge cut for 2 hours. This electric one, they could use it for 8 hours. And this is a company that were using. Their working day was 7.5 hours. So even if they picked up that strimmer when they clocked in, and the hedge cut when they clocked in, and to the whole length of an A road in that 7.5 hours, they can't hit their maximum point limit. Whereas before, after 2 hours, they could have in theory done it before lunchtime. So sort of remove the ability to breach the ELV. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to do. They're still at risk, and they're still trying to bring that down. But that's one of the options. And another, we sort of work with a well-known quarrying company. You said the name earlier, with Tarmac, where what works we like to do quite well is sharing best practice across companies, where companies have you have a company with lots of sites that just won't communicate with each other, where quarry A has found a really good way of doing this task with this tool, and it's about sharing that information and using that best practice. And obviously we do that with companies that deal with. But what we'll have the ability is, if a company comes to us that we've dealt with in a separate issue, like I said earlier, I can guarantee that if you've got an issue, we've dealt with it somewhere else, we can sort of use that best practice and sort of apply it to your business.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So you've mentioned that just going from one powered type of tool to another powered type of tool meant you could use it longer. So for the layman's, you said you could use that one for only 2 hours, but use the other one for 8 hours. So what's the difference between the two? They're both are powered, both will vibrate and obviously have a motor spinning of some sort.
Yeah.
So why can you only use one for 2 or one for 8?
It's pure to every to the basic science of it. Again, I don't want to get too much into the witchcraft argument again, but every single tool vibrates at a level. It's the meters per second squared, which is the magnitude of the tool. And basically, for this example, if you imagine a petrol, if you imagine when you'll see it when people are starting up chainsaws and hedge trimmers on the side of roads, that pull in that cord, gets the engine going, and it starts ticking on. You can sometimes see it vibrating off on its own accord. What the battery symbol with the battery on the side was doing, an operator would press a button and it would wake up, and quite a few wouldn't even realise it started. And especially when you're working in residential areas, that's usually quite a benefit. So it's that the way that power comes in. So petrol tools, because they're already vibrating before the trigger's even pressed, and then you get the kickback from the hedge cutters or the grass on the road, and it just it amplify that vibration up just on the power source. So that's where we try and look in towards the more battery and electric powered ones as we sort of move into trying to get into a bit more carbon neutral way of working as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think the example you gave was really interesting, because from your kind of products, being able to talk to a customer and say, well, actually, if you just switch to a different tool, you could be more efficient, more green, and save yourselves a lot of money, which actually was probably in the best interests of your business, where you could sort of sell lots of sort of tools to operations. But that's one of the reasons why I'm talking to you guys, because that approach.
Yeah, exactly, and it's very, very easy to fall into the it's very easy to fall into the trap of just continuously monitoring for the sake of monitoring. That'd be very easy. So we sell kit that monitors, and monitor is like if you look at Eric PD, it comes very low in terms of monitoring. It's not at the top. So we work through that flow chart, and we sell. It'd be very easy for us to say, oh yeah, you've got this really bad risk, you need to monitor it all the time. But if you're not trying to solve that issue, you're wasting your money, you're wasting your time, and you're wasting everybody's time. So, and people aren't going to look at you very kindly. It's like, you've sold us all this kit, but you're not actually solving the issue. You're just telling us how long we're using these tools for, which is an important step of it, but it's a means to an end, essentially. And yeah, we are essentially trying to put ourselves in a much more of a difficult position, because the less vibrating tools, the less once that risk disappears, people. But that's what we're here for. We're trying to make HAVs not an issue anymore. Trying to get rid of that disease, as soon as possible, really.
And I think I think for anyone who's watching this video now, or taking part of the e-learning, if they've got a particular sort of hand tool that they use regularly for a job, and it's coming to the end of its working life, and they're considering a replacement, everything we've talked about now, that and I know HAVI have a lot of information where you've analysed lots of tools out there. You might be able to sort of talk to you guys and say, I've got this now, but I need to change it, and you can actually sort of recommend a tool that would be a lot better for them.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like I say, if there's an issue that you've got, I can almost guarantee that another company that we've dealt with has had that issue. Whether it's grinding metal down, whether it's breaking out concrete, that sort of thing, polishing, drilling into materials and stuff like that. We'll have dealt with it elsewhere. So if we know that a customer uses this, our aim is always to get people using their exposures down. So we'll always look at that. It's all, again, going back to the Eric PD, the reduction side of it. That's the second step. So we always look at trying to use better tools and better practices to try and lower the exposure. So we'll have seen the task being done before, and we'll recommend and say, this has worked with these. Well, it's might you get that tool in for a trial. We'll also come in and we'll measure that tool in your task, and then we'll set up a bit of a monitoring exercise to see what the exposure is, and if that process is better than your previous one, fantastic, you've ticked a box. Scrap the old process and start working in the new process. And when the HSC come in, that is what they love to see. They love to see you've identified an issue and you've found a replacement, and you've looked at that reduction, because elimination isn't always an option. Work still has to be done. Blocks still need breaking, cars still need polishing. This task still needs to be carried out. So it's just about getting done in the safest way possible, really.
Yeah. No, that's excellent, and I think, like I said, it's worth looking at the tools out there, rather than if you've got sort of an old faithful whatever. I'm trying my best not to say a brand, because I don't want to bring a brand into this. But if you've got something, go, I love that particular, and just go out and get a like for like when it comes to if it's working live. This is about thinking about that and just taking a step back and going, well, actually, is there another tool out there that does produce less vibrations, or a vibration frequency that means I could use it longer and is less risk for me? So
exactly, yeah.
So we've talked a lot about hand-arm vibration and vibrating white finger and things like that, but there's also something called whole body vibration. So do you want to just quickly, for the layman's again?
Yeah. So I definitely don't want to delve too much into witchcraft, but this is where people really get confused with whole body vibration. So whole body vibration is covered in the Control of Vibration at Work Regulations 2005, which is everything that we do is all to those regulations, as you can imagine. The symptoms and the cause are very different, because whole body vibration is rather than transmitting through the hands, obviously, it's, as you can guess, it's whole body. So it's mainly traveled sort of through the back, the seat, and the seat of the operator. So back up through the spine, or through the feet of the operator, through the equipment. So it's sort of most common that you see day to day is sort of old tractors and forklifts, but the ones I imagine you, Anthony, and the people you speak with will be your big quarry and your dumper trucks, your earth moving machinery. That's where the big issue comes from. If most people, anyone who's got anything to do with whole body vibration, they're the ones that they'll first think of. The dumper trucks you see driving, spending all day pretty much driving from one point to another and then back up. You're doing that for a long period of time. And then there's obviously lots of other factors. Sort of posture in particular is a massive one. The posture and the heavy lifting. So if you're heavy lifting lots of stuff and then you're picking up with a forklift, and then you're dropping off and you're moving stuff again, all factors that are going to sort of affect sort of your back, and which is the main cause really with the whole body. The one thing that the HSC have admitted, and this is written clearly on the way, if you click on whole body vibration on the HSC's website, one of the first things it says is that they admit further study is needed into the causes of what the actual impact is on an individual. But what we all say is the technology has improved drastically already. In just those things like things that you probably wouldn't even notice. So like spring seats on forklifts and tractors and ride-on mowers, that sort of thing, and even on dumpers, where just sort of soften that vibration rather than just having the suspension of the vehicle, having actual suspension for the operator themselves who's operating a bit of kit. So yeah, the technology is already improving, but like I say, that's further study definitely needs to be done. But we can measure the whole body, and we can manage the risks, but the actual causes and the diseases that come from it are still pretty unknown territory for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yes, I often wonder, and this makes me think, with the amount of potholes that I've got on local roads, should I get it just my commute? But that's another story. So if an employer or an employee, has taken part in this e-learning or watching this sort of video playback and thinking, oh, hang on, I might have some concerns about particular pieces of equipment or perhaps a process that we're having to do, what would your kind of advice to them be right now?
So, like I said, first thing again, you use the tools that are available. So the HSE have published quite handy bits of kit, where you can just for a start, the HSE calculator, which you'll be familiar with. I imagine you'll be all over your e-learning, because it's a really useful tool where you basically you list your processes. So if you've got a workshop bench, for example, that's got a grinder, a drill, and a die grinder on there, you could put that into the calculator, put the magnitude in either from. We don't really like to use manufacturer's instructions, but as a starting point, it's quite a good place to be. We also have databases and stuff where we've got more measured and more accurate information. You put in a calculator, you put roughly how long you expect the tools to be being used. So it'll tell you how long the tools can be used. And then you could say, well, we expect the operators to use it for, an hour a day, a couple of hours a day. And it'll tell you how many points to be expected to get, where the risk level is. So from there, you'd have a good idea, what your level of risk is. And then, again, and if you see that there's a level of risk, best thing we can say is, call the experts in, give us a shout. We deal with it, and it's not like we have charge you, just have a conversation. Call up and we can discuss through the risk. And if the risk is very minimal, we'll tell you. You could probably crack this with a decent spreadsheet and a stopwatch. There's always that option. But when it needs managing, when it needs monitoring, one of the things we sort of, the benefits of us not to go too salesy and too preachy to everybody, but we sort of offer like an integrated solution. So we sort of try and take the strain out of managing it. HAVs very rarely gets to the top of anybody's to-do list. It usually sits in mid-table, between, by noise, dust, falling from working at height, that sort of thing. It very rarely gets to that, that top unless there's an issue. So, we sort of take that strain. So if there is ever an issue, we've already got all the information sort of available to us. So we like to have a sort of a seat at the table, work alongside you. We do all the work in the background. Then once a month we'll have a half an hour meeting, go through the findings and the risks and the actions that we'd recommend. And then again, it's just about following those actions. And this is everything from, like, say, tool measurements, operators exposures, mini audits, that sort of thing, to just so you got an idea of, if the HSE ever came in and started asking questions, or if you ever had a claim, you've got everything all in one place. And you don't have to spend a boatload of money either, which is always such a big thing. I think that's why people maybe doesn't always end up at the top, because they always think, oh, I've got to spend a lot of money again for this witchcraft. I'm not entirely sure how it works. So it doesn't have to be any more expensive than what you spend on boots, on eyewear, on earwear, that sort of thing. It's so just get in touch, give us a call. We can nail it out pretty easily for you.
Yeah. That's great advice, Joel. And I think, like you said, it does sound a bit daunting when you're talking about tables and spreadsheets and things. Yeah. There will be links, obviously, as you've said, in this e-learning for people to download it, but it is quite straightforward. There's lots of drop downs, entering some simple information, and straight away employers or employees can make a start and just seeing where they are. So, we've mentioned a bit about regulations, but I think it's important, because regulations, it is thou shalt do this. This isn't guidance. This is So if someone's watching this and they've kind of not come across kind of HAVs regulations before, and I'm going, oh, okay, I didn't know that was a thing. What would you say that some key points in regulations that I really ought to pay attention to?
I think it sort of falls into the the same way as most areas of health and safety is risk assessment. So that's everything we do. We always say risk assess things rather than say you don't want to fall into the trap of just monitoring all the time. Find out the tools and processes that you're using. Find out your operators are at risk. The HC have got it written down very clearly on their procedures. If you want to manage HABs, first thing you do is get a list of your operators who are at risk. Find out those operators. Find out the tools that you're using. Get a rough idea again using the calculators about how long they're using the tool for and the levels of risk. And the base aim is to try and get everybody to as low as reasonably practicable. That's the end game. And then use your hierarchy of control, use the ERIC PD, eliminate first, reduce, like a bit of a test here for the Irish thing. So reduce, isolate instances, isolate sort of processes where there is more of a high risk area, use the controls in particular, with the training and that's usually where a good process will fall apart. It's through lack of training, lack of having those controls in place, making sure the operators themselves are aware of the processes and what it is that you're trying to do, rather than just sort of keeping it into the background, trying to keep it to yourself. Bring them in, make them aware, because if you're going to be trying to swap their tools out for, like, say, the old reliable, they've got this old reliable bit of kit. If you're going to be swapping that out, they're going to know why. Inform them, make them aware of that. And then one of the points I always say is, because people we get this question a lot, is obviously PPE is one of the big parts of ERIC PD, but it's towards the end of the hierarchy. Is PPE and HABs isn't really a necessity. There's no bit of PPE that's going to solve HABs. Even though sometimes we get asked a lot about anti-vibration gloves, which it's a bit of a pain trying to get people back from that. Anti-vibration gloves essentially don't work. So if there was something that reduced vibration from a glove, there's no way we'd be in business, because it'd be a very easy fix. But what we would say with gloves in terms of PPE is, get good gloves rather than spending stupid money on anti-vibration gloves that don't work. Get good quality gloves that keep the operators' hands dry, keep them warm, and stop those nips and scratches that they're going to be getting. That's it with PPE. And then obviously with the discipline, it's once you've got that risk assessment, sticking to it, making sure that the procedures and everything's being followed, and if there's any issues, jump on them straight away. And if there's, especially operators when they get symptoms and that sort of thing, making sure that they follow that. So yeah, that would be my sort of advice, is for the whole. But say to begin with, use those resources that are available.
Yeah. That's excellent, Neil. And again, I think when I reached out to you before, I found you guys kind of really educational, and I'm glad you talked about the anti-vibration gloves, because I did find that very interesting. And I know, as you explained to me, that yes, they do absorb a certain frequency, but it's nowhere near the frequency emitted by a power tool. So
exactly,
it reduces a frequency. Well, you don't come across that anyway.
Yeah.
And again, like I said, I was looking at these things, looking at the cost of them, and going, well, if we've got gloves, why do we need all these tools and things? But
yeah,
it was really interesting. And I think that's one thing I really liked about your business, is the wealth of educational materials as well that you bring when we talk to you when I was a customer. So any last minute bits of advice, Joel, any sort of thing, like, I know you've learned a lot of things from lots of different employers. Is there anything you've picked up along the way that, continually comes up you could sort of share with us all now?
I think the sort of most important thing is that we'd say is the accuracy of the data that goes in. So when you're building your risks, obviously we're building the risk assessments, and we spend a lot of time making these really good risk assessments, but making sure the accuracy of the data that goes in is correct. So what I mean by that is if you've got if you're using the tools, making sure that the measurements that go into those tools are to the correct standards. Now I won't bore you by talking about the standards, but there's two standards: there's 5349 and 8041. That's how the tools are actually measured. And if they're not measured to that standard, all the information that we do for the rest of the risk assessment is absolutely useless, because we don't know what tools are actually vibrating at. So making sure those tools are measured to the correct standard, and again making sure that accuracy. So if you aren't using the tool timers and the tools that you can see over my shoulder, if you are getting operators to monitor their own, which is absolutely fine, you can monitor that way. Just making sure that the information is accurate, because if you put in rubbish data into it, you're going to get rubbish data out of it essentially. And that's why we value the sort of quality over the quality of the data that comes in. Makes it, we'd much rather get some data of an operator that's really accurate for a week, rather than a year's worth of data that's just here or there, completely useless information to us. And that's sort of saying that. And again, sort of that hierarchy of control. People spend so much time focusing attention on continuously monitoring data,
Yeah.
And just for the sake of it, and it's a waste. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of the operator's time. It's a waste of your money as well. You know, just it's that sort of sample monitoring and monitor operators for a period of time, get an idea of what their risk is, and then move on to the next one. You know, don't bother an operator for the next 3 years monitoring when he's only getting 20, 30 points a day. He's not going to thank you for it in the long run.
Absolutely. Well, that's been brilliant. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think we've got some amazing information. So I think that wraps up my my sort of drinking tea with HAVI, and having a conversation with you, Joel. And I'd like to, thank everyone at HAVI for participating in this and working with the Institute to sort of share your knowledge and experience to actually help raise education